right, so let's look at some of our discussion questions that we had on our Colossian outline. So let me just emphasize again, we were in our Colossian outline from last week. And there were just a couple of discussion questions that we wanted to talk about. And then we will jump into our new congregation, which is going to be the church at Thessalonica. So remember the church at Colossae. It was a good church. It was a solid church at the time in which we read, time in which we studied. They had some difficulties. Does anybody real quickly remember the difficulties? In particular, there was one major difficulty. We kind of termed it by two words. No, very good. That was the church at Ephesus. Very good, Sherry. You're thinking. No, that's very good. There was a heresy there. There was a Colossian heresy. And remember we said, while you read the Bible, you won't read the words Colossian heresy. That's what men have termed it, and that's essentially what it was. It was a mix of Judaism, a mix of paganism, and the worshiping of angels. There was a lot going on, and Paul dealt with that in the book. So let's talk about the first question here. What was Paul's answer? And remember, we're looking at these congregations to look at ourselves and to try to emulate them in the right areas. What was Paul's answer to the problems the church at Colossae was facing? What was the answer to that? Now, there's really no right or wrong answer here, and why I say that is because there's a couple things. There's one major thing I'm thinking of, but there's a couple things. Yes, Sherry, and then Sherry back there. Okay, keep proper focus. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and that speaks volumes. Keep a proper focus. Yes? Yeah, very good. Absolutely. So do it with all your heart. Now think about the book of, both of those are correct, by the way. Both of those are great answers. Think about the book of Colossians. What is the book of Colossians about? What's the primary focus of the book? Christ. Very good, Brielle. So when you look at the book of Ephesians, you have the church of Christ. Paul's like doing this. He's like setting the church of Christ in the book of Ephesians. In the book of Colossians, he's doing the Christ of the church. He sets the Christ of the church up. And so that's not to say the book of Ephesians has nothing about Christ, because you can't separate the two. Talk about the body, you talk about Christ. But the emphasis, the primary focus in the book of Colossians is on Christ. And so I would submit to you, and that goes back to both of what Sherry said. Sherry said, keep your focus on what? On Christ. Do it heartily unto who? The Lord, to Christ. Keep your focus on Christ. Paul's major answer to the problems that they were facing, whether it's Judaizing teachers comes in, some forms of Judaism, some forms of paganism, he says, don't get wrapped up in that stuff, but keep your focus on the preeminent one, the Christ. Colossians 1:18. And I would submit to you that we as Christians run into major problems when we take our eyes off of Jesus. And isn't it easy to take your eyes off of Jesus? You think about the New Testament passages that keep emphasizing the fact, keeping your focus. And if you don't, you end up missing exactly. So just by way of a real quick illustration, have you ever gone into the grocery store with maybe a list of one or two things? And when you go into the grocery store, you're kind of like, you can. I'm not saying you do this, but I'm saying you kind of lose your focus. And the next thing you know, you will come out of that store and you may even not have the two items that were on your list. Now you're all laughing. I think that's happened to somebody at some point, right? Why? Because you lost your focus. You completely lost your focus. And that's in any area of life. It really is. Christianity's no different. It's easy to lose our focus. Why? Because there are struggles in the world. There are things that are in our own minds, their own personalities, their own struggles, sin struggles. There's besetting sin. There's frustrations. There's life happens. All these things can pull us away. Sickness, financial burdens, all those things can pull us away from our focus. But what is our major focus? Paul said it needs to be on Christ. Now I know it's easy to say that. The challenge is to keep that focus. And I think it's just coming back to keeping the main thing, if I can say it that way, the main thing. It's so easy to lose our focus. It's so easy to make things other than the main focus. Christ is our focus. And if you think about it, If we don't keep him central, we'll miss the whole boat. We'll miss the whole boat. So can that happen to the church? Can the church miss the whole boat of really keeping Christ as our focus? Yeah, we think about everything else, don't we? We sometimes, Christ is our focus. Christ is our focus. All right. And when he's not, let's back up and let's refocus. Let's refocus. All right. Number 2. What are some current philosophies that threaten the Lord's church today? So there were some philosophies of men. Like Paul said, some were saying don't eat these things, kind of don't handle these things, stay away from these things. They were philosophies. He said sometimes they even appear as really wise, really good. But he said they're really not. What are some philosophies, would you say? Yeah, Doug. Boy, that's a great one, isn't it? And doesn't that sound good from a religious perspective? Because we say, well, we love everybody. We love everybody. That's exactly the second part of that verse, right? But the first part has to be preeminent. We have to love God more than that's a great one, Doug. Yeah, and that's really infiltrated the religious world. It really has. So therefore, nothing's wrong. Everything is, as they say, candy and nuts. There's a saying there. It's just, everything is just kumbaya. Everything's great. When you love God, there's a standard that we don't change for that. So that's a good one. Yeah, that's definitely a current philosophy. What else? Yes, Jess. Yeah. Boy, that's a current philosophy, isn't it? It is certainly a current philosophy. And you know what's interesting? That one sounds wise to people too. Doesn't that sound good? Like everybody's pretty much going. And I just heard this the other day. I just heard a guy say this. He said, just remember, there's just many roads. There's many roads. In fact, there's a denominational site. I'm not going to tell it. I'm not going to tell it to you because I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. I do like some of their stuff they have on there. They have some videos that is pretty good. Some of the stuff's pretty good. But just today I was reading an article from them, and it said he was, because I'm studying for the Lord's Supper. We're not going to move the landmark, the ancient landmark. Don't move the landmark of the supper. Okay, that's going to be this Sunday. But as I was reading, I read this article, and he said, it was funny, I'm going to deal with this in my sermon, but he said, some people call it the Eucharist, some people call it the sacrament, some people take it once a month, some people take it once a quarter, some people take it every week. He said, it really doesn't matter. You just do your thing the way you do it, but remember Christ. Well, doesn't that sound good? That sounds kumbaya. That sounds warm and fresh, doesn't it? But you know what? Oh, I almost told you the website. If I told you the website, you'd flip out, okay? Because it's supposed to be Bible-centered. And I'm like, wait a minute, what he just did was make friends with everybody, except me. Now, without work, which he doesn't know me, he doesn't care. But my point is, isn't that all encompassing? So if you say, well, I take it once a quarter, I'd say, kumbaya, that's great. Well, I take it once a week. Well, that's great. That's no problem. We just take it once a year. Oh, that's great too, as long as you remember Jesus, right? Yeah, we call it the sacrament. Oh, that's wonderful. We call it the Eucharist. Well, that's wonderful. Go ahead and call it whatever you want to call it. Take it whenever you want to take it. And basically, as long as you remember Jesus, I said, you fool, man. That's exactly what he is. He's a fool, because that is a philosophy. Goes back to what Jess said. Sounds good. Sounds good. How about that praying Jesus into your heart? I think if I hear that one more time, I'm going to just choke. Like, where is that found? Everybody knows Matthew 7:1. Judge not that you be not judged, but they can't find the passage that says, pray Jesus into your heart. Like, why can't you find that passage? Well, it's not there. Yeah, exactly. And it sounds good. And you've interview 100 people in our community, I guarantee you 99 of them, probably 100, but you might run into one of our members. So if you found 99 of them, they would say that would be okay. That would be okay, and it's not even biblical. Proper philosophy of men. Yeah, great. Yeah, Allie. Okay. So proper philosophy, they've taken the judgment and what God is going to deal with men, and that's a great one because that has gone. And you know what's interesting? The whole hell and judgment of God has been taken out of religion many, many years ago. And now it is infiltrating the church. Somebody told me years ago, this guy, actually the guy that converted my parents, he had this saying, and I don't know if there's any truth. I mean, there's some truth to it. I just don't know if he had the exact years. But he said, you give it 20 years. When something comes into a denomination, you give it 20 years, it'll come into the church. And that was his, and he'd seen it. He'd seen a lot of things. I'm not saying it wouldn't be at 19 years. I'm not saying it wouldn't be at 5 years. But that was his saying. And that's true. Because now, even in our brotherhood, some have taken the whole teeth out of hell and judgment. It's interesting, Ali, you said that. I had a conversation with a man yesterday who was trying to help me to make all this money. He was a scammer, and I knew he was a scammer. And so I talked to him about scamming people, and I said, you know what? One of these days, my friend, you're going to stand before God, and every dollar you've taken from some poor old widow that didn't know any better, you're going to give an account for it. And he says, I'm not afraid of God. He said, in fact, I will have sexual relations with the angels when I get there. Well, you know what do you know what he heard? You know what he heard? This is so funny. I sang to him, there's a great day coming. Oh, he was laughing. I sang to him on the phone. There's a great day coming, a great day coming. He must have thought I was crazy, but I wanted to make sure he understood there's a great day coming. When the sinner shall hear his doom. Can you imagine somebody saying that? You can't talk to them, Allie. They've completely taken the whole pangs out of God's judgment and wrath. Very good one. Yeah, very good one. Patty. Wow.
And it's sort of we should love everybody. And I tried to make her understand we're to love the sinner but still hate the sin. But nobody wants to hear that. It's
right.
About tolerating anything and everything.
And that's the sad part. That's exactly that is such a popular philosophy. You know, what does it matter? What's interesting to me, and just never forget this. Somebody told me this years and years ago. Atheism, even atheists have a standard. Okay? They make it seem like they don't, but they have a standard. And let me share something about that. So what if two same-sex people want to get married? Okay, we shouldn't say anything about that. Fine. Well, you know what? I think if a grown man wants to have relations with little wee babies, I don't see why you should have a problem with that. Okay? Now, I don't believe that. I'm being I'm being super off the top here to make a point. What am I making a point? Almost everybody draws a line before that, right? Exactly. Yep. So my point is, where do you get that standard? Why is that wrong? Why is that wrong? Well, you say, come on, it's wrong, God. Exactly. God. You just said God. You have a standard. If you're going to have a standard, trace it all the way back to the origin and go with one man and one woman for life. Anything outside of that is sin. And that's not me saying it, that's God. That's not loving, that's being truthful. And sometimes truth is the most loving thing we can do. In fact, I would say truth is always the most loving thing we can do. We can sometimes do it in an unloving way, but truth is loving. Truth is loving. Yeah, very good. Good ones. Anybody else? Sammy, and then Crystal.
Rodney, you got your truth, and I got my truth, and they got their truth. That's another one.
Yeah. Yeah. Isn't that the most... And that's so popular. You're right, Sammy. That's a popular... Doesn't it sound good? Well, that's Sam's truth, and that's my truth. But you know what? We don't want to follow that to its logical conclusion, do we? We don't want to follow that to its logical conclusion. And you know what? We don't believe that in any arena of life except religion. I guarantee you, if you went into the doctor and he said, I'm going to operate on you, you've got this problem, and here's how I'm going to do it, you would say, well, I want to get another opinion. And the other opinion said, well, I'm going to go through your head down to your heart. That's how I'm going to go through. And that's his truth. Listen, you would say, that guy is not right. He's going through my skull to get to my heart. Why wouldn't you just go right through here? It'd be like Donna back there. She had that mass removed in there. They said, hey, Donna, we're going to go up through your foot. We're going to cut your leg off. We're going to go all the way up to get to that mass. Donna would say, wait a minute, I want a second opinion. Second opinion comes in and says, no, we can just go right through here, Donna, and do it. Well, that's just your truth. No, there's a standard. There's a procedure to go in and get this mass off of me, and it's not your interpretation or my interpretation. There's a right way and a wrong way. Absolutely. Good one. Yeah, Crystal. Yeah, and there again, people don't understand where they're going to end up in eternity because of that lifestyle, and not stepping in is the most unloving thing to do. It really is. Of course, we don't kick people out. That's a denominational concept, but what we do is try to instruct people in the way of the Lord, and certainly can't tolerate sin. Yeah, good philosophies. They're not good philosophies. Good example of men's philosophies. Yeah, anything else? Yeah. Yeah, and again, every one of those, who's the focus off of? Focus is off Christ. Christ, preeminent one, truth. Christ is the way, the truth. Yeah, Jill. Yeah. Good point. So Jill said, for those who couldn't hear us, it's the idea of just pushing the responsibility on somebody else, or blaming, not taking. But we live in a generation like that, don't we? And it's popular. It's popular, but really you don't grow in any area of life, and truth is the same way. You don't grow in Christ until you say, wait a minute, this applies to me. I need to look at me. And yeah, so those are all, yeah, Sherry. Yeah, that's a great point, Sherry, and I'm glad you said that to her. And again, I think it's real important to remember that let's just follow that logic out. God wants me to be happy. Okay, let's follow that. Do you think Jeffrey Dahmer, we just talked about Jeffrey Dahmer tonight, do you think Jeffrey Dahmer was happy when he was mutilating people, putting them in his freezer? Yeah, he loved it. That's what he did. That was his thing. So why should anybody tell him? Don't you think God wants them to be happy? Right? Let's follow that logic. You say, Rodney, you've lost it. Exactly. Because I've left logic and gone, and this is powerful too. When you think about the logic of these things, there was one of our professors who was like, he's logical and he's a philosopher and he's all that stuff. He told us this. He says, no man turns on logic until logic turns on him. And I've found that to be very true. Everybody wants to be logical until their logic turns back on them. And that's essentially, God wants them to be happy. I agree with that. God wants you to be happy. So let's just do whatever we want. God wants me to be happy. No, Rodney. No, now you're getting ridiculous. No, I think you got ridiculous when you stepped into that arena. Patty. Yeah, and it goes back.
But that's somebody, apparently there's not a lot of motivation to learn.
Well, yeah, I agree with that. And what's happened in many, and listen, we don't want to just put this in the denominational world. We want to remember this about the church too. So in the denominational world, the Bible has been buried for the most part. The Bible has been buried. They don't preach the Bible. Now, I'm not saying no one ever anywhere preaches the Bible. I'm saying for the most part, The denominational world does not preach the Bible. They preach stories. They preach, current events. They may tie a verse into it, but that's not Bible preaching. But, and I know my brethren, some of my brethren are there. They don't preach the Bible either, because it's real good to give a 15-minute motivational speech on Sunday morning. Pretty much everybody will love you for that, but nobody will grow closer to Christ for that. His word is what is spirit and life. That's what gives us life. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. The bread of life. You have to know about Him. You have to know His word. Again, who do we keep as our focus? You want to be sustained? You keep Christ as your focus. Great discussions. All right, so in the book of Colossians, we looked at a little bit of this angel. He said, there's apparently some angelology going on, some worship of angels. And I just asked the question, how is angelology, the study or the worship more in particular of angels, still a problem today? Or is it a problem today? Yes?
People talking about St. Paul and St. Peter and everyone worshiping Mary and holding them just as high as Jesus.
Yeah, exactly. So departed spirits, they say, hey, they're just like Peter. Ali said, like Peter, Paul, Mary. They'll hold them equivalent to Jesus. Yeah, exactly. And how about this? And you might be thinking of some too. How about this? When somebody passes, and especially if they're a younger person, seems to be a lot of times a younger person, so that they'll inevitably stand around the casket and they'll say, well, I guess God just needed another angel. Let me tell you something. God doesn't need another angel. And when a person dies, they don't become an angel. Okay? I know we all like I'm sure you like the movie just as much as I do. It's a Wonderful Life. Every time a bell rings, an angel gets his wings, but that's not true, okay? That was a Jimmy Stewart movie. That was funny. It's hilarious. I love the movie too. We ought to all watch it around Christmas time. I think it ought to be an American tradition, not a church tradition, it's an American tradition. But great movie, but listen, it's not true. When you hear a bell ring, it doesn't mean that an angel got his wings. It doesn't mean that an angel is going to come back and talk to you, and it certainly doesn't mean when you die you're going to become an angel, all right? You are not an angel. You'll never be an angel. And that's the truth of it. Now, I'm not saying that at the casket, when somebody says that, that's my time to deal with that. I don't deal with it then. I won't deal with it, because that's not the time or the place. But angelology is a real problem today. What else? What else do you think about angelology? Anybody else have any perspectives on that? I know you could find, and I'm not saying, by the way, I'm not saying that it'd be wrong to buy little figurines of angels. Don't interpret that this way. Those are cute little things that we sometimes set up in our house and stuff, and that's a personal decision. But, a lot of times those are sold as religious, kind of almost like idols. And I'm not saying because you buy one, it's an idol. That's not what I'm saying. So please understand that. But it can be. They can become like these little, people set them around to kind of like bless your house, Well, you honestly, I mean this all kindness, but you can set a rock up there and it'll give you as many blessings as that angel will. Really, it will. Because the blessings come from God. He may employ angels. He won't employ those little figurines. He'll employ real angels to bless your life. He always does. He always has. And I believe He still does today. But yeah, we don't want to get into that point of worshiping angel. Some people even say, I saw an angel and, I did this or whatever. Listen, even if I saw an angel, I don't plan on it. But if I do see one, I'm not worshiping the angel. You remember John, the book of Revelation? Remember that angel that came and he fell down and he said, hey, get up. Remember Peter? He fell down. He said, don't do that. Get up, right? I'm not God. Don't worship anybody but God. All right, last question. In Paul's day, Jews were trying to incorporate their religion on the church. Is there a great threat of this today by religions other than Jews? So the Jews were coming in and kind of like keeping some of their religious traditions. I'm not talking about, their customs. I'm talking about like their religious traditions. This is what we need to do in order to be saved. Think that happens today? Yeah, sure. No. Yeah, that's a good point, Sharon. Just yeah, like it's sacred still. Yeah, great point. Think about this. I just had this happen just the other day, right out here. So, and it's really funny. I think it's really interesting how God works. Did you notice? You may not have, but that house to house we just got that went out to 1,000 mailboxes in our areas. Did you see what it was on? It was on the Old Testament and the New Testament, the division of the two. Just had somebody say to me the other day, one of our visitors, they said, well, I still really like to worship on the Sabbath. I'm really a Sabbath person. And I said, oh, okay, got you on that one. I said, no, I'm not. In fact, I'm anti-Sabbath. And anti-Sabbath, how in the world would you be anti? I said, but I'm anti pretty much anything by way of religion in the Old Testament. I don't uphold any of that. And the question was put to me, well, you don't kill, do you? I said, well, no, I don't kill. Well, 10 Commandments, one of the 10 Commandments says do not murder. Well, absolutely. I don't murder, but I don't do it because the 10 Commandments said it. Like, that has nothing to do with the price of tea in China. Just like if you steal my horse, I'm not going to scalp you like the Native Americans would have at one time. I'm not going to put you before a firing squad like the British would have. Why? Because I'm under the Constitution. I don't live under Native American law anymore. It's still wrong to steal a horse, okay? But not because the Native Americans didn't want you to steal it. Not because Britain said it was wrong to steal it. It's wrong because the law under which we live today says it's wrong. Jesus said, don't murder. The Old Testament said don't murder. Has that rule ever changed? Well, the rule changed. The same rule is in the New Testament, you might say, but it's not based on the 10 Commandments anymore. And so it's important for us to understand that. And I'm excited about that because I think that's going to open a door for a study. I hope it does. It looked like it might have. And, I said, well, just like, I wouldn't worship on Saturday any more than I would slice a lamb on the communion tables. I wouldn't do that. Why wouldn't you slice a lamb? Because it was Old Testament. Why wouldn't you worship on Saturday? Because it was Old Testament, right? So the logic has to follow. So, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, people, and the 10 Commandments are huge. Like, people think the 10 Commandments are still binding and, we live under the 10 Commandments. Why? Because well, the Bible's been buried. The Bible's been buried. You can't study the book of Hebrews. You can't study the book of Hebrews and say we're going to live under the 10 Commandments. Not unless you want to live under the Aaronic priesthood. And that was an inferior priesthood, right? Christ's priesthood's the one. Yeah, great point. What else? Well, the landmarks I'm going to be dealing with the next few weeks. Man, I'm telling you what, there's some things trying to be brought in to the church through those venues, what denominations do. Let's become like, and it's funny because, Israel wanted a king. Why? So they could be like the nations around them, right? Sometimes the church wants to be like the denominations around us. Let me tell you something, folks. Christ as our focus. We don't want to be anybody. We don't want to please anybody but Christ. When we please Him, we've pleased Him. That's it. That's all we really have to shoot for. And strange? Oh, yeah, it's strange to people in the denominational world. The way we worship is strange. But isn't it funny how biblically it's very not strange? It's exactly what the Bible says. Anything else? Whew, what an example, right? What an example for us to follow. Stand with Christ as our focus. Let's look at the church at Thessalonica, okay? The Thessalonian church. This would be your new outline, by the way, that hopefully you grabbed on the table back there when you came in. Let's talk a little bit about the background to the city of Thessalonica. That's kind of important because it helps us to kind of establish the fact where we are, and what we're doing, and what are some of the background things that help us with this. By the way, if you want to know more about the city of Thessalonica, there are some great resources that you can find. Most of all this good information that you can get from a Bible dictionary, Nelson's New Illustrated Bible Dictionary. Now, when we went through our How to Study the Bible course, I showed you some of those. Listen, those aren't exhaustive by any stretch. Like, I have a handful of Bible dictionaries because you really need, you might want to have more than one Bible dictionary because sometimes it won't say everything you want in one, so you need to dig more. But today, you can get on the site studylight.org or Blue Letter Bible, and a lot of these resources are online for free. So if you said, well, I wanted to study the church at Thessalonica, I wanted to study the city, it'll give you more information than I'm going to give you in this class. Just FYI, just so you know how to dig this stuff. So the city of Thessalonica was uniquely situated on a major Roman road called the Egnatian Way. The Ignatian Way, Rome was famous for building roads. Rome was famous for building everything. They built up everything pretty much. They were in power at this time and previous to this too. And so from Italy all the way eastward, there was basically a road, and it was called the Ignatian Way. And there were several roads in that area, but the Ignatian Way was a major highway, and this is where Thessalonica was located. Because of its unique location, of course, you can imagine that really brought a lot of industry. It made the city really boom. Lots of people coming, lots of people going. Some of our cities today are like that. When people are coming and going, there's industry, there's money being spent. It's funny, when you go north, some of those little towns, they don't get hardly any traffic through them. But this is just a little plug for my hunting friends. Hunters really help support a lot of those little towns during hunting season because they stay in those little hotels, they eat at those little restaurants, they buy gas at those little gas stations, and a lot of times there's a big industry happens during hunting season in those little towns. Why? Because people are heading that direction. That's why Thessalonica was able to grow. People were coming through that area. And now, don't take what I said and think hunters were going through Thessalonica, because that's not what I said, okay? I'm saying people were coming and going, and they were building the city with lots of money, lots of traffic. The Romans, who were in control, they were a world power at this time. And prior to this, they divided Macedonia into 4 major sections. 4 districts is what they called them. And this happened about, just for our knowledge, 168 BC. About 168 BC, they divided Macedonia into 4 districts. Thessalonica, city of which our study begins, became the capital of the 2nd district. So they had like these 4 districts. Thessalonica was in the 2nd district, and it became the capital of that district. And then about 20 years later, Macedonia as a whole became a Roman province, and Thessalonica was Macedonia's capital, okay? So at first it became the capital of District 2. About 20 years later, it became the capital of the entire Macedonian region. It tells you something about the city. It became the capital, then it became the capital of the entire region. So this is going to be a city that's booming. It's going to have a lot of people. It's going to have a lot of things going on in it. It's going to be a busy place. Paul comes to Thessalonica, and he visits it. And interestingly, he's with a man some translations call Silvanus, or we might know him better as Silas, and Timothy on the 2nd missionary journey. Now, just for a little background, Paul went with whom on his 1st missionary journey? Barnabas. Why didn't Paul and Barnabas go together on the 2nd missionary journey? Yeah, they disagreed about Mark. And so Paul said, I'm not doing this. Barnabas said, me either. So, I'm sermonizing here. Paul said, well, then why don't you take Mark and go to the hills, and I'll take Silas and go over here. And so that's what happened. And of course, Timothy was picked up on this journey as well, and Timothy was Paul's traveling. Yeah, actually it was one of those blessings. Sometimes what seems like a bad thing can actually be a blessing to God's people. Yeah, very good point, Randy. Yeah, 2 missionary tours. What's interesting is we don't read a ton about Barnabas and John Mark's missionary tours. And somebody might say, well, why don't we read a lot more about them? Well, that's not the focus. That's not the focus. What's the focus of the book of Acts from chapter 13 on? What's the focus? Yeah, going to the world, Sherry. Absolutely, you got it. Remember Acts 1:8, Judea, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, then the uttermost parts of the world. Acts 13 starts that uttermost parts of the world. And Paul's kind of the main character there. Why? Well, when he was converted, God said, I've got plans for you. You're going to be the apostle to the Gentiles. Now, he went to some Jews first. Then finally he said, enough of you people. I'm going to the Gentiles. And that's one of the blessings. Again, but that's like goes back to what Randy said. What looks like a bad thing actually was a good thing. Paul is suffering a lot from the hands of the Jews, so he turns to the Gentiles. And that's exactly God's plan to show the gospel to the entire world. And we'll see that as we go through this. All right. Let's start with our Roman numeral number 1 would be your first blank. It would be the derivation. The derivation of this congregation, Thessalonica congregation. So AD, if you want to turn your Bibles to go ahead and turn to Acts chapter 17. We'll kind of begin there. So AD about 49 to 50, somewhere in there. And that's really interesting too if you kind of chart Paul's life. Because, you know, we get a lot of good stuff from Paul. And this is kind of second missionary tour, AD 49 to 50. Paul leaves Philippi. So just for a minute, I just want to back up. What I think is really a good study about these congregations for me, and I hope it is for you too, it kind of connects the dots, if you will, for the Scriptures. Sometimes you'll read about Paul going to Philippi, but if you don't continue the journey, sometimes you're like, well, what happened then? Or, you know, sometimes you read about the church at Colossae, but who were they? Where were they? What was this all about? So for me, it kind of helps connect the dots a little tighter in God's story. So Paul leaves Philippi, and you remember Acts 16, first part of Acts 16, he gets a Macedonian vision. Come over here and help us. So Paul leaves and he goes. And goes down through the region of Galatia, Troas, all those places in the first part of 16. He comes to Philippi, and just by way of background, let's walk with Paul today. Who did he come to first at Philippi? Lydia. And then that conversion was a great conversion. He baptized her and her household, and everything went great after that, right? No. There was a troublemaker there, and that got Paul thrown where? In prison. Paul and Silas in prison. And so then now they're in prison and they're singing and praising God, praying and singing, Acts 16:25. And then the next thing you know, great earthquake happens. The jailer's about ready to take his life. Now they convert the jailer and his household. The nucleus of Philippi starts. Okay, so when I think about this, Paul's getting ready to go to Thessalonica and the wounds on his back aren't even yet healed. Okay? Don't miss this, because to me this is a great story of Paul. So he leaves Philippi and he comes down by the Ignatian Way. He's on that Ignatian Way. He passes through a place called Amphipolis. Okay? Amphipolis. I think I said piff. It's a piff. It's a fifth. Amphipolis. And if you want to try to say that 3 times really fast, I would love to hear you do that, okay? If you want to do that, we'll do that afterwards, okay? Come up and say Amphipolis 3 times real fast. All right. And then he went to Apollonia on the way to Thessalonica. We find that in Acts 17 and verse 1. Now, when they had traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Now, something that you might want to do, it's helped me in my study. Maybe it'll help you. What I did was I went through the missionary tours of Paul, and with a red pen and a highlighter, I just highlighted the cities he came to, and I numbered them. Okay? And so when I'm studying, it helps me because, you know, I can back up here to Acts 16 and I can see, well, Acts 15:41, he comes to Syria and Cilicia. That's 1 and 2. And so I can just watch his journeys, because what you can do then is you can take a map in your study and you can follow Paul. Most good maps will have a section of Paul's missionary tours, and you can follow him. And what it is when you go to the cities, what happens sometimes we read of his travels, but we don't connect the dots, if you will. Pardon the pun. But we don't connect the dots. We don't think like, this is Paul. So for me, like when I was thinking about Thessalonica, he left Philippi. Remember, he was beaten in Philippi. He was in the jail in Philippi. The jailer dressed his wounds, part of repentance, and then Paul leaves Philippi. He's still, you know, I think of it like this. Have you ever like done something to yourself and then 3 or 4 days later or 5 days later or 2 weeks later, you're still sore? Like Michelle might be able to remember something like that. She's still sometimes sore weeks later, right? Months later maybe. Well, yeah, so think about this. Paul's not going to Thessalonica like, man, I'm in great spirits here. Everything's great. He's still bruised. He's still beaten. He's still from the last ordeal in Philippi. And he comes to these next 2 cities, he's preaching the gospel. I'm like, are you kidding me? The guy doesn't stop. Then he comes to Thessalonica, and you think, oh, everything's going to be great in Thessalonica. So he goes into a synagogue of the Jews. Why would Paul go into a synagogue of the Jews? Yeah, that's where the people were. Now here's something you want to notice, okay? What day of the week does Paul go into the synagogue? Saturday, on the Sabbath. And he does it for 3 consecutive Sabbaths, Acts 17 and verses 2 and 3. He goes in there, he's there for 3 continuous Sabbaths, and he's preaching to these Jews. Now, it's interesting. I want you to see the 3 weeks. And the reason I say the 3 weeks is because some people were like, man, we want you back. Come back next week, okay? We'll see you on the Sabbath. Some of them apparently were sitting back there and they were biting their nails and the steam was starting to roll out their ears. They are getting mad. And it's funny to me how, and I see this more, I guess, in Paul's ministry, maybe than any other ministry, although the other ministries are clear too. But you see the gospel, how it depends on the soil as to depending on the success, so what we would say the success of the gospel. So in Thessalonica, there are some that say, this is great stuff. This is the greatest thing we've ever heard. Tell us more, Paul. See you next Sabbath. There are some says, he comes back in here, we're going to cut his throat. This guy is making me mad. Okay? So, what was it the gospel that was the problem? Doug? That's a great point, Doug. You know, a knife can be used for great things. It can be used to slice your meat, but it also can be used to kill somebody if you want it. So, it depends on the use of it. The gospel, depending on the circumstance, depending on the heart, depending on the person, as to how they're going to receive that message. And I just find that very interesting, because what do we often think, folks? What do we often think if somebody gets upset with the truth? What do we sometimes think? Maybe not often. What do we sometimes think? Yeah, we did something wrong. Or, oh man, I think they were mad. I don't think, I've had people, not so much here, but I've had people say that to me. I think that person left. I don't think they like that message. Well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry they have a bad heart. Right? Now that doesn't mean that you can't say something sometimes in the wrong way. And that's true. Sometimes you can. Sometimes the heart's bad. Sometimes the heart's bad. Some of these people had a bad heart. Some of these people had a great heart. And it didn't matter to Paul. He was going to preach the truth, and he was going to let the chips fall where they may. That's what I love about Paul. He just preaches the truth. All right. So he's there for 3 consecutive Sabbaths. Now here's a question. What do you think he was primarily preaching about? Like, what would have been his topic, do you suppose? Yeah. Prophecies from the Old Testament about Christ. Now, how do we know that? How are we pretty sure about that? Exactly. And what scriptures? The only ones that were in book form at this, or scroll form at this time. Sorry, didn't mean to say book. The ones, yeah, remember, Acts 17, the New Testament's not written yet. So Paul's got the old Jerusalem gospel bound up in the Old Testament. And I love that part. Did you just ever wonder what he did? Did he go to Genesis 3:15, talk about the Messiah who would crush the head? Like, where did he go? I'm sure he went to all those places. I'm sure he did. But he's reasoning with them. That's an interesting thought. I want you to think about that for a minute. So he's laying out the facts in a logical way from the Old Testament. Here's what the story was about. Here's what the message is about. These people knew the Old Testament, and now he's making it come to life. Here's what's interesting. Some Jews and a considerable number of Greeks. By the way, who are the Greeks? Give me another word for them. Gentiles. Yeah, Gentiles. Together with high socially standing women. I thought that was interesting. There were some women in this city that were socially standing very high, and they apparently converted to Christ. Acts 17 and verse 4. Here's something else that's kind of interesting. As we study the rest of the book of Acts, we come across 2 men who apparently were converted at this time, and they became traveling companions of Paul's. These 2 men are, number 1, Secundus, S-E-C-U-N-D-U-S, Acts 20 and verse 4. So if you hold your finger there in Acts 17, Acts 20 and verse 4, he was accompanied by Sopater of Berea, the son of Pyrrhus, and by Aristarchus and Secundus of the Thessalonians, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and Tychicus, and Trophimus. Interesting, when I'm studying the book of Acts, sometimes I'll read over those, and I won't catch that. But I want you to think about this. He's reasoning with the Jews. He's reasoning with the Greeks. He's reasoning, some of these women are getting on board. And what happens? Some of these guys believe it so much that they become traveling companions of Paul. Look at the next one. This Aristarchus, of course, there. And then look at Acts 19, verse 29. The city was filled with confusion. This is Ephesus, by the way. And they rushed with one accord into the theater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. That is really neat to me, because so Paul's preaching, he's converting people to Christ, but there's some people that are so on board with this, they're like, we want to go with you, Paul. We want to preach the gospel. We want to help you in this ministry. We want to help you along the way. And so Paul takes them, and you can also read of them, Aristarchus, Acts 27:2, Colossians 4:10, and Philemon 1:24. They became very much traveling companions of Paul. It's interesting to me how sometimes when you read the Bible, you'll come across names, and if you don't stop, Crystal, if you don't just really dissect every part of it, you miss it, don't you? You miss it. And that's one thing we're enjoying so much with our study of Crystal. With Crystal, we're not studying Crystal, we're studying with Crystal. Let me get that straight. Our study with Crystal is, Crystal just loves the Bible, and she's reading every part of the Bible, and she's wanting to know every detail of it. Isn't that great? That's a hunger and thirst for righteousness, by the way. And that is awesome. And she pointed out something tonight from the book of Genesis. She asked me a question, and I said, I've never had anybody ask me that question. In fact, I've never even thought of that. Now, that's not a great thing, because there's lots of things I hadn't thought about. But this was something that I should have thought about, and I didn't. And so we dug, and we found the answer. But kind of interesting how that sometimes works. When you study little parts and pieces individually, you really get the meaning of it. So here's a couple of guys that we meet. Now, we don't know how long for certain Paul stayed in Thessalonica, but here's something that's neat. So while he's there in Thessalonica, remember he left Philippi, come through these other two places, comes to Thessalonica. While he's there, the Philippians sent aid to him on two different occasions. Philippians 4 and verse 16, even though Paul said he was working day and night to sustain himself. 1 Thessalonians 2:9, 2 Thessalonians 3:8. Something really interesting. What was Paul doing in Thessalonica to sustain himself? Oh, yeah, he was making tents. And there was an interesting outer, I wouldn't call it a garment, I would maybe call it a, Michelle, what would you call the outside of a tent? The rainfly, okay. Maybe a glorified rainfly, okay. He was making, there was a garment that was a type of material that was really known in Thessalonica. And some scholars say it would have been really, what do I want to say, a good industry for Paul there to make a living at making tents. And so he's making them, he's sustaining himself day and night, but the Philippians sent him aid two different times while he's in Thessalonica. Remember, when we studied the book of Philippians and the church at Philippi, remember how they were such a close friend to Paul. They were a friend. And in Philippians 4, he said, how that your aid of me, your care for me flourished again. It's like a flower blooming again. He said it came to fruition again. And so Paul was close to these people. They sent him aid. Another interesting point about Thessalonica, the derivation of the church there, is that the success of the gospel aroused jealousy in some of the Jews, and a riot ensued. So the brethren sends Paul away to Berea. Okay? So while he's preaching there, we don't know how long. We know at least 3 consecutive Sabbaths that he preaches in the synagogue. We don't know exactly how long he's there. He preaches. This jealousy is aroused in some of the Jews. Remember the bad soil. They begin, to basically want to kill him, want to take him to task on it. And so the brethren say, Paul, get out of here. Go to Berea. Okay, so he goes to Berea. And of course, that is where that infamous statement is made. These who? The Bereans were more noble or fair-minded than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness of mind and searched the Scriptures daily, see whether those things were so. That's kind of the theme of our first and third Sunday night class, the Berean class, and that's where that comes from. Paul was aroused, the Jews were aroused to jealousy. They basically drove him out. The brethren said, get to Berea. He goes to Berea, and while he's there, he goes into Berea, and they're just receiving the word with all readiness of mind. They're like, preach it to us, man. And they're searching the Scriptures. What's interesting to me is, don't you think Thessalonica was pretty good too? Don't you think there were some good people there? But somehow Berea must have been a little bit better, or at least noteworthy in this respect, because Paul said these were more noble. Actually, Luke said it as he records this. And so it was at that time, that same time frame, that then the jealous Thessalonian Jews come down to Berea. And why I want you to see that is because the devil doesn't want to let you alone. When you're doing good, the devil won't let you alone. So the Jews come down from Thessalonica to wreak havoc on Paul at Berea, and the brethren send Paul to Athens by sea, and then Timothy and Silas stay in Berea. So Paul's the main one here that's getting the brunt. I find that interesting. Silas and Timothy don't seem to be in as much trouble as Paul is. And so they stay back in Berea. Acts 17:13 to 15 tells us. It's the derivation of this congregation. Second missionary tour, they come there, they reason in the synagogue for 3 Sabbaths. They're there for some time. Philippi sends some aid to Paul to help him in his work. They, I jokingly say they were, printing material, they were printing tracts, they were printing Bibles and sending them everywhere, okay? Not really, but they were publishing the gospel during that time frame. Then Paul goes to Berea and he's sent out. Now, before we go to the next part, we aren't going to, we're going to stop there for today. I want to ask you a question. I want you to think about something rather. It's a question, but I want you to more just contemplate the question. So Paul is doing the right thing now. He's preaching the gospel. Since Acts 9, he starts doing the right thing. Really changes his life and he does the right thing. Does it seem like what's happening to Paul in preaching the gospel is fair? Yeah. And what's interesting, Doug? Jesus laid it out in the context of Paul, by Paul's own mouth and writings, to say that all who live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. Sometimes it's easy for us, and I just want you to think about this. Sometimes it's easy for us to say, I'm doing the right thing. Why is this happening to me? I've heard that. I've heard people say, I felt that. I've said that. I'm doing the right thing. Why is this happening to me? Has nothing to do, oftentimes. Now, you could do the wrong thing and something could happen. That could be that's one of the consequences sometimes. But just because something bad happens doesn't mean you're doing the wrong thing, does it? Right. It's a great point, Doug. We often look at things that happen to us as bad, and I know who wants to rejoice in those? Who really wants to rejoice in problems? I know we're told to, but I'm just saying, who really wants to do that? But just because something is terrible in my life does not necessarily mean that I've done something wrong. And you remember that was Job's 3 friends' problem. They said, Job, this is because you did this and this and this. And Job's defense was, no, I didn't. And God's defense was, no, he didn't. Now, he didn't tell Job that, but that was God's defense. You didn't do nothing here, Job. This is Satan. This is the working of Satan. I just look at Paul and I say, here's a godly man, here's a faithful man, here's a Christian. Real example of a Christian. Look at what happens to him. you know what? God had it planned. And when we suffer persecution, it's part of God's plan. Sometimes it can be the best thing for us. It's hard, isn't it? It's hard. Nobody likes to suffer persecution. Sometimes my prayers are foolish. Pray for God to just give me a good day with no problems. He must laugh at that, right? Because problems sometimes help us to grow. Sometimes help us to see what's important too. All right, great. Let's conclude tonight. Let's look at the next one next week. Church at Thessalonica. Come back. We're going to talk about how it grew. And then we're also going to talk about some of the problems that this congregation had and some of the ways that they fixed. What you're going to see in a lot of these problems, it's interesting, almost all the problems are somewhat interrelated. And you know what that encourages me about? The church today, the problems are almost all interrelated. They're doctrinal, they're outside persecution, there's something, but you can usually kind of put them under one heading. Problems really don't change that much as time changes. It's just usually different faces. All right, excellent. Thank you so much for coming to Bible class tonight. If you will remember, Sunday morning at 9 a.m. will be our Bible study, and then we will move from there to our worship, and we will worship God in spirit and in truth, and then we will conclude that worship. We will go to the multi-purpose room. Some meetings will happen. A couple of things will happen at that point. We'll split off for some meetings, but we'll join back real soon, I promise, to get some food together, and then